From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
The Kentucky House of Representatives overrides Governor Andy Beshear's veto of a bill that would allow the state to take part in a new federal tax credit scholarship program. This as Texas parents flood the state's new school choice program with applications as the deadline nears. This is All Things with Kim Strassel, and this week we are catching up on what's happening out there in the extraordinary reform story of the past years, which is school choice. And I am joined by Tommy Schultz, the CEO of the American Federation for Children, to talk about the progress, but also the more desperate rearguard actions now being staged by teachers unions. Tommy, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. It's fun to be winning, and thanks for having me, Kim.
Yes, it is fun to be winning. You know, I am old enough. I still remember the dark days where those of us who wanted school choice would just push so hard even to get, a charter school here or there. So this is just an extraordinary new environment. But I also would just like to mention to everyone, I'm someone that spends my days talking about the frustrations of a gridlocked federal Congress. And so the other thing that I'm really struck by here is how the real story out there is what's happening in the states, and in particular school choice. And before we go talk about Kentucky or Texas, I was kind of hoping you could give us a state across the union when it comes to school choice, the progress of recent years and where we stand now.
Sure. It's just been a tidal wave of momentum. And really, if you look in the last 5 years, there have been 80 laws passed in 30 states, either creating school choice programs or expanding them. And if you look at what that has resulted in terms of number of new students and new funding for families that they can control for their child's education, in 2020, there's about $3.4 billion going out the door for about 500,000 or so families for private school choice options. Now, this school year, thanks to Texas, which you mentioned, it's going to be about $10.5 billion, benefiting maybe about 1.5 million students. So then when you factor in the fact that you mentioned the new federal education freedom tax credit, which comes online next year, I mean, it is just an absolute tipping point moment for the school choice, really parent-driven movement that has been going on for nearly 40 years in many cases. We're so excited because at the end of the day, that just means more and more families are getting access to the best education for their sons and daughters. It means that the teachers unions, they're losing their grip of power over our kids' K through 12 education pipeline. And our hope is that once this federal education freedom tax credit gets really rolling, that all 50 states will opt in and every single kid in America can actually finally have access to school choice, which would have been a preposterous notion to really put out there even 10 years ago, right? So really exciting time here in the school choice movement. And I think it will ultimately lead to a golden age of K through 12 education finally in America.
I certainly hope so. And it's been so fun to watch. This has happened methodically, kind of state by state. And now some of the big ones obviously are done. You talked about Texas, but that is something that I've noticed those of you who are pushing for it, you kind of look at a state and then you try to drive it home. Where are some of the next targets? Where are we still behind? And what's next up on the schedule to try to get it in place?
Sure. There's still a handful of states, particularly in the red state dynamic like Missouri, Mississippi, that need to make some pretty big jumps. Even Georgia, I think in the next few years, all those states will get it done after a couple of election cycles. But really, the federal opportunity gives a way to both lower the temperature around school choice, because every state that would have naturally resisted this, any state that's totally beholden to the teachers unions, they'll say, we don't want to jeopardize state funding, or they'll stick to the common old arguments that they've used for 30 or 40 years that's saying this is draining public school funding, which it's really not. And it's actually the parents' funding that they should be controlling at the end of the day, not the bureaucrats or the politicians, right? But once this federal thing comes online, and once we've already seen one state, Colorado, with a Democratic governor, Jared Polis, he's already opted into this federal opportunity. And so I think once more and more Democratic governors realize, wait a minute, this is essentially free federal money that's actually private contributions from people in our state that are donating to local nonprofits, getting a tax credit for that, I think they'll start to realize and go, oh gosh, this is a no-brainer. Why would I limit families from benefiting in our state from this new education freedom tax credit? So I think at the state level, you got a handful in the red and purple category that are going to make some meaningful gains over the next few years. But really the last of those 80 laws across 30 states that I mentioned, that really took a number of states, whether it's Iowa, Florida, Indiana, Arkansas, now Texas, like they really went from 0 to 100 in a lot of cases. And I think now that the remaining states that are on the map are both going to have some pretty significant gains, but not going to go from 0 to 100. Or we will have, as part of this federal opportunity, a number of states, even could be California, could be New York, that go to finally having school choice for all their families.
Well, let's talk about that, and in particular, this new federal tax credit. So this is a program, obviously, it passed last year as part of the reconciliation bill that allows donors to give scholarship granting organizations money and then claim up to a $1,700 tax credit. Now, the thing is, states have to buy in. There have been a number of red states that have, after the federal government put out recently some of the rules of the road. Let's talk about Kentucky. This is a red state, but run by a Democratic governor. And the state legislature passed a bill to opt into this program. The governor, Andy Beshears, let it sit on his desk for nearly 2 weeks. And then suddenly he vetoed it. And now already this week, the Kentucky State House has come out and overrode that veto. The assumption is the Senate will too. But this is a fascinating dynamic. I mean, I'd like to get your thoughts on what you thought Andy Beshears was doing there. But also, it's been interesting. There have been some states immediately, blue states, that came out and said, no, we're not doing this. But now they seem to maybe be changing their mind. Hawaii, New Mexico. What position is all this putting Democrats in?
Sure. So I'll go reverse chronologically. The states that initially came out, they said, and they just, I think, took the union talking points saying, this is a new national school voucher program, and this is federal funding into private schools. And they immediately said, we're not going to opt in. And then Paulus opted in because he probably actually read the bill. And these other states, even some of them, like I laughed at the Alaska Education Association, the teachers union, they said pretty quickly, they're like, we oppose this. We don't know what's all in the bill, but we're opposed to it, right? So the knee-jerk reaction is now, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's starting to cool in terms of temperatures, because all these Democratic governors are looking at this going, gosh, donors can still donate in our state. They will just, all that means if they do not opt in is that a donor, let's say in California, or let's say would have been in Kentucky, they would have been donating their money because it's a federal income tax credit, but they would have to donate out of state. So they could have been donating to Texas when potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in California could have stayed within California. The Kentucky example was an interesting one because much of the political prognosticators have been saying that Beshear could be a presidential candidate. He's got the moderate timber, the modern Democratic Party that could actually succeed over the AOCs or the Bernie Sanders of the world. And lo and behold, he's a guy who went to private school. He's a guy that has been pulling the ladder up on school choice from everyone else behind him. And he vetoed this bill with the typical union talking points. And guess what? The legislature actually just a few minutes ago, breaking news here, but the Senate just overrode the veto. So they now have opted in to the school choice program at the education freedom tax credit level, at the federal level, because the legislature knows our parents want this. The donors that we know are going to be donating in droves to this, they need to keep their money in state. They should have that option. And so super exciting day for Kentucky families long term, because at the end of the day, this will be bringing private contributions off the sidelines into K through 12 that can be used for, yes, private school scholarships, but it can also be used for tutoring expenses or special needs therapies. The scholarship groups do have a good chunk of flexibility per the federal law. So this is really an exciting day, and overcoming this veto is a really big shot across the bow for a lot of other people probably watching this fight.
Yeah, I can't wait to see how this rolls in some of these other states, because again, the argument is, what are you just going to turn down essentially free money for kids in your state? It's a crazy position to have just to satisfy a special interest in the Democratic Party. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Tommy Schultz, the CEO of the American Federation for Children.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Introducing Virtuo Up, the latest in a long line of innovation from Nespresso. It's innovation you can touch, sense, and taste in every single cup. With a 3-second start, easy open lever, and dedicated brew over ice button, it's even easier to enjoy your coffee your way. Sip for yourself. Shop Virtuo Up exclusively at Nespresso.com.
Welcome back. Kim Strassel here with Tommy Schultz talking about school choice. The politics of this, though, I am finding interesting because it isn't just on the Democratic side. Obviously, we have this new program rolling out in Texas. It's huge. It's a big deal. But it took a real fight to get there, and it took the governor, Greg Abbott, coming out swinging against some Republicans who were standing in the way of school choice. You just wrote a really strong opinion piece for us called No Argument arguments left against school choice. And it was talking about the recent Texas primary. And of course, all of the attention was there on the Senate outcome, James Tallarico and Jasmine Crockett and John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. But you had other news. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. For so long, people had said Texas is impossible. The rural Republicans are beholden to the massive schooling apparatus, from the unions to the superintendents to the school boards. Most people probably don't realize this nationally, but for instance, Florida, a flourishing school choice state, they have about 67 counties that have 67 school boards. So 67 superintendents, 67 boards run by the unions in a lot of ways, but a little bit different dynamic than Texas, which has 1,200 school districts. So each state representative may have half a dozen school districts that are, full of well-paid lobbyists, full of superintendents, overseeing billions and billions of dollars in each of their school districts. So just the mechanics of how the union apparatus, the superintendent apparatus, the school district apparatus can really block anything from happening at the reform level is just really incredible. And so fast forward after about 20 years of not getting momentum, or fits and starts and failures of trying to get real school choice legislation across the finish line, 3 years ago now, basically 21 Republicans voted against in the House the big package that would have included school choice and even massive public school funding. 21 Republicans bucked the governor and said, we're not going to do it. Well, after this last week's election cycle in Texas, everybody's focusing on the top of the ticket. But beneath that, after this election cycle, thanks to Governor Greg Abbott and his team and his campaign efforts, partnering up with our campaign team, at the end of the day, come next year when the Texas legislature reconvenes, there will not be a single hostile Republican in the House or Senate in Texas. Not one. They've either we beat them at the elections, or they all quickly retired, or even the ones they flipped their votes because they know, gosh, this is a winning issue and I'm going to get primaried and lose my election. So it is now this new rule of politics, really. It's sort of this law of physics that school choice is really political gravity, that if you're opposing it, you're probably going to lose your election. And so, especially in these rural states, for everybody that said rural states won't do it, gosh, look at Oklahoma, look at Texas, look at even parts of Ohio, Florida that have been expanding their actual private school supply because these school choice programs have been giving funding to families that have said, we want to build our own private school here, right? So this is the exciting future that's ahead now in all of these states. And we just finally beat back the last vestige of an argument that the rural Republicans do not support this at all. Well, many of these major rural Republicans that oppose school choice lost their elections by double digits. So end of that argument.
They are gone. Yeah. Well, that's the politics. And therefore, I actually want to turn to another piece of this, which is something I recently wrote a column on. And I did so in part with help from American Federation for Children, who has been deeply involved in this. But for a long time, the teachers' unions, which obviously have been the most hostile force against school choice, have just banked on having the politics in their pocket. And now that's not working for them anymore. So they're going in a different direction. And that, of course, is litigation. So they're trying to go to the courtroom to try to shut down some of these places. We have Governor Brad Little, who signed legislation creating Idaho's universal choice program in February of last year. And a coalition has now sued to try to derail that. We've had similar situation in Wyoming, in Utah, in a number of other states. Talk about what's going on here.
Sure. So as you alluded to, this is the last grasp at a straw that they can pull together to try to put lawfare into the system. They're losing at the ballot box constantly. They're losing in public support. I mean, you especially look at minority support for school choice. It's often 80% for African Americans and Hispanics, 70% overall. I mean, it's rare that any issue in American politics polls that well. And so they're trying to do lawfare in each of these states. Every time we pass a program, we fully expect them to file a lawsuit, usually, Kim, right the day before parents are supposed to apply, or right the day before that schools are about to get kids in the door. I mean, that just shows how sinister they are, right? They could have filed a lawsuit the day after the program passed, but no, they'd rather wait till the most politically disadvantageous time for families at the end of the day. And we saw them do these types of antics when they closed schools for 2 years in two places. They just don't care about families. It's about their power, their funding. They want it all. So you look back at the history of this, though, they've been beaten practically every single time. There's only, I think, been one real case where we've really lost, and that was on a real weird technicality. But you go back to 2002, Supreme Court, Zellman case that said the Cleveland voucher program was constitutional. That was really the seminal case that for many years kind of quieted down the lawfare. But then really what kicked off the modern era of very interesting cases started in 2017 that led to kind of a triple crown of three cases on really around religious liberty. So your readers know this because if they followed any of this, the Trinity Lutheran case, which at the state level, they tried to block for this like little Christian school, the ability to get recycled playground tires to kind of make the playground safer. They tried to block it saying this violates our state constitution around funding private schools. And the Supreme Court threw that out because it was just a ridiculous argument. And then 2 more cases came after that really solidified this idea that, look, just like with the Zellman case in 2002, the Supreme Court has said these are neutral programs. You're not funding religion. There's no violation of church and state. You're giving parents funding that they control and they can choose where they want to go. They don't have to go to a faith-based school. They can go to a traditional non-sectarian school, right? And so at the end of the day, these state level cases, though, again, we win them all because they make these tortured arguments that usually go fly in the face of precedent. And I think their new strategy is the hope that like the justices have just forgotten that some of these cases are 25 years old. The Zellman case, right, in 2002, maybe they're forgetting the precedent, but it's like they consistently lose so much. I think the Idaho case you referenced was really great because some of these arguments the unions are making is that, well, all these state constitutions have usually a clause somewhere that says you must provide basic or common or uniform public education for all students. The Idaho court didn't really want to give the union standing on this even, but they said, well, we'll hear it out to see what they have to say. The court just rejected their argument 5-0 because they basically said, yes, it's akin to like the Idaho's constitution had said, you must provide everybody a minimum wage of $500 a year. If somebody wants to pay them more, they're not restricted from that. So yes, we can provide both public schooling to families at a uniform and free level, but that doesn't preclude us from saying families can also control their funding to go to other institutions, private, charter, you name it. So they're just going to continue to make these novel and tortured arguments, I think, that time and time again, we're going to beat back pretty easily. But it does cause some significant disruption, or families get, worried about applying. Like, look, I don't want to put my eggs into this basket or think about switching my kid or talk to them about, we're going to have a little bit of a disruption. We're going to go to a new, better school for you because I don't know if the courts are going to rule on this. So thankfully, we're able to defeat these pretty quickly. The courts are able to rule pretty quickly. But time and time again, I don't know how many Supreme Court cases they have to lose until they learn their lesson. But I like that they're burning their money on these cases, I guess. So,
well, the tactics really are somewhat despicable. I mean, it really puts into relief how they don't really care about the kids, because you would not leave kids and families in this kind of situations. About the money, explain this to me if you can, because it was something that's curious to me and I couldn't really get an answer. But I've noticed that in some of these lawsuits, while sometimes unions are involved, often it's school districts. If that is the case, are they actually using taxpayer funds to launch this litigation as well, too?
Oh, they'll say they won't, but whether the unions are often the money supply, the school districts, the superintendents, they're all getting campaign contributions from the unions, which those are your tax dollars, right? Because it's tax dollars you're paying to teachers who then are getting the money removed from their paychecks by the unions each year. And at the end of the day, they'll have one of their front groups or entities, a nonprofit, or they'll prop up a family. The unions will fund the lawsuit. That's kind of how this all works for them. And they have virtually unlimited money. So I know people will talk about, like, the Kamala Harris campaign spent $1 billion, right, for the presidential race. Between the two national unions, the AFT and the NEA and all their state affiliates, I mean, they're bringing in nearly $4 billion in revenue every single year. So, I mean, they are such a behemoth in politics, particularly Democratic primary politics, that it's just hard for any of these kind of nodes within the Democratic Party, or, like you're mentioning, the school districts, the superintendents, the school boards, they all have to basically jump at however high the unions tell them to jump in many cases. And so my hope is that in the future, we're seeing some of the dam break a bit with Jared Polis opting into this education freedom tax credit for his state. I think enough people will go, gosh, the unions have nothing but a losing set of issues that they keep fighting and losing on. Why do we want to keep hitching our wagon to them? I'm excited for the day that when potential Democratic presidential candidates say, like, look, I'm going to fight for the families in my state. I'm not going to listen to the unions anymore, because it's such an old system that they're still trying to focus on and hold up, that has been, as we see in every single national test score that comes out every 2 years, that our education system is failing, and our kids are getting dumber year over year, despite spending about $1 trillion each year for all the state and federal money that we're pouring into this. So my hope is the politics do get better, because the unions, after so many losses at the legislative ballot box or with these lawsuits, that eventually some smart Democrats will go, wait, why do I want to keep hitching my wagon to them?
We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more with Tommy Schultz.
When you want your spring break to feel like... and your kids' pool day to feel like... and your hotel bed to feel like...
Ooh, and room service to feel like... Because at Hilton, hospitality feels like...
Your cabana's ready. Would you like fresh towels?
It matters where you stay. Book now at Hilton.com. Hilton, for the stay.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome back. Are teachers getting that message? Because I always like to draw the distinction. The union and the union leadership are not the teachers. And there are many very good teachers in public school systems. I mean, my kids go to public school, have gone to public school, and there have just been some incredibly wonderful, dedicated teachers there who are not always happy themselves with their representation among the unions. One thing that I have found interesting is that in some states, not all, but in some states where they've been passing school choice measures, they've been paired alongside kind of experiments in trying to reward good teachers in a public school environment, whether the raises or merit raises, et cetera, stuff like that. What are you seeing in terms of that and in terms of teachers themselves and their view of how unions are going about this?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic because the unions, they just care about warm bodies. Just to be clear, they're calling them the teachers unions is a bit of a misnomer because they'll organize graduate students. They will organize janitors. They'll take any warm body that's a paycheck, like dues paying member. And it's why you saw when they closed schools for 2 years, trying to get that $192 billion during COVID, during the federal timeframe. I actually just talked to a friend who said, yeah, they got hired a few years ago in the teaching system and they got fired because all the COVID money ran out. It's like, that's the union playbook. Hire a bunch of people, long-term positions with one-time funding with the implicit assumption that we know, like, hey, we'll probably be able to leverage the government again to get more funding. They really just care about bodies in the system. And that's why you've seen this huge explosion in growth of administrative staff. But the teachers themselves have been really hampered by this because while there's been like a 125% growth in the admin side of the equation, there's only been like a 7 or 8% growth in teachers and in students in our public school systems over 25 years. And so it just shows you the kind of different asymmetrical games that the unions are playing because they also know that the average teacher is only in the classroom for about 3 years. So they just need the warm bodies to keep going through the system. They just need to recruit them. They don't care if the former teaching corps got dejected. And what you're now seeing, though, on the other side of that is the knock-on effects of school choice. I'll point to Florida for 2 examples. The most likely person to start a new private school, particularly like in a rural area, is a former public school teacher. It's been about 60 new private schools have been created in the last 10 years in Florida in their kind of rural communities, often by a public school teacher who said, I got sick of the old system. I got sick of the union dynamics. And then 2, the other knock-on effect of school choice, because nearly 600,000 kids are using school choice in Florida out of about 3 million public school kids writ large, that you've actually seen the union memberships drop so low in Florida that they almost decertified the Miami-Dade teachers unions a couple years ago. And I know the Florida legislature is working on another kind of push at that to say, hey, if your union memberships drop below this other level, you might get decertified. So the unions, again, the only proposition that they were holding over teachers was like, we have your health insurance and your other insurance that you need to rely upon us. There's now alternative teachers associations getting started saying, hey, you don't need to be partnered up with these radical political groups. Like, I know you want to be a great teacher. If you need insurance, you need the health coverage. Some states are providing that themselves too. But I think you're going to start to see this old school, unionized model of K through 12 education start to slowly die off in a lot of ways because the unions, again, they're wild, they're radical. You look at any number of whether it's Randy Weingarten or Becky Pringle, they are really pushing these radical ideas. They're fighting at the federal level for a ton of things that have nothing to do with education. I think enough people are starting to wake up to this going, gosh, why as a teacher do I want to be stuck in this system with these unions that are causing me all sorts of problems? They're taking $1,000 out of my paycheck each year. Why don't I join some other association? Why don't I just try to be a great teacher, try to get my pay? Because also the unions always promise that we got more funding, it's going to mean more pay. Well, they never tell them the fine print that actually it's not going to reach the classroom. It's going to go to the admin, right? It's going to go to the teachers unions themselves. So I think in the long tail of this, like the unions are just going to be facing a real problem of declining membership levels.
Yeah, when I was a kid growing up, I went to a one-room schoolhouse almost. It was a very small place. And we had a teacher in each classroom. There were 3 classrooms. It was 1st through 3rd grade, and a lady who did our lunches and watched us on recess. And pretty much the whole school managed to get along just with those 4 people. So last question, and it's kind of a big one to end with, but I just don't want to leave without getting your thoughts on this. One other thing that's been going on, big news in education world, is obviously the Trump administration's efforts to potentially wind down the federal Department of Education.
Yes.
Those are still in early days. We've had some proposals from Linda McMahon, the secretary, to transfer some duties to other departments and changes in how the money might be handed out. But how does this feed into what's going on out in the states right now, or does it?
Sure. And it's interesting on the politics of all this. You mentioned, whether it's the school districts or local education associations, as they're called, and state education associations, or the state kind of departments of education. It was notable that when President Trump, Linda McMahon were pushing out this idea that we are wanting to try to either block grant funding to the states or bring the education department down to the studs and redirect the funding and all the mechanics to other places, especially the states. We want to give states more flexibility. You actually didn't hear a lot of the hand wringing or the calls to block this from the states, because the states themselves, they won't tell you this publicly, but ask any kind of local district or state education agency. It is a nightmare dealing with all of the federal rules and regulations and strings attached with any program, whether it's Title I to Title IV, you name it. You go through all the weird funding pots that are there. At the end of the day, they're yeah, we'd rather control it and better suit it to the needs of our locality. So in some ways, it's this interesting juxtaposition where it's kind of a universal position that the federal Department of Education has gone awry. It's kind of one of the worst decisions we made, centralizing so much of especially the regulatory ideas in K through 12 at the federal level. Not as much funding necessarily. But 2, I think Linda McMahon and her team are really pushing so diligently to bring this down to the studs, reorganize it. I hope too, but the part of the beauty of why we passed this tax credit is that it doesn't rely upon the Department of Education, right? Because it's a tax credit. This will be operated out of the Department of Treasury. It also means Treasury operating the tax code is pretty black and white and clear. You can't eventually saddle on nefarious regulations or strings that get attached, like with most Department of Education funding, kind of block grant, the new grants, like some of the Common Core era stuff, race to the top, that a lot of people got really ginned up about federal education issues in the 2013 era. Now this is a federal tax credit. So it's just you have an income tax, you can potentially donate. And so at the end of the day, this is where the politics of all this, the administration's been really smart to make the moves at the department level, but then also the biggest expansion of school choice ever in history was passed as a tax credit that can live within the Department of Treasury. And that'll keep it cleaner, fewer politics, fewer strings attached.
Fascinating. And I hope that that's the direction that we continue. Tommy Schultz, CEO of the American Federation for Children, we want to thank you for coming on this week. We want to thank our listeners for joining us. If you like the show, please do hit the subscribe button. We are here every week. And if you'd like to write to us, you can at atkim@wsj.com.